For more than half a century, Pathé newsreels offered the people of Britain a vital window onto the world. From global conflicts to ideal homes, from leisure crazes to love-ins. They reflected British culture and recorded all aspects of our lives. Pathé established their own unique way of delivering these stories to the nation.
The news was told as though it was an action thriller.
With pomp and pageantry, President and Madame Lebrun of France are entertained in London.
The rousing delivery of Pathé's voiceover artists would become familiar to millions.
The newsreel commentator is one of the most distinctive sounds, I think, of the 20th century.
There were none but heroes at Dunkirk. It was the most superbly heroic operation of all time. And by the grace
One man above all possessed the voice of Pathé.
Let the greatest tribute of all be paid to the men who fought and fell in the rearguard actions. Newsreel cameramen, war correspondents...
Bob Danvers-Walker was their most famous and durable commentator.
The whole vicious venom of Germany's war machine was then turned against the British Isles.
What he said was what we all had to accept.
In its darkest hours, Pathé had encouraged a nation under siege.
What spirit, what courage, what men! Good hell, sailor, have this one on us!
The government soon realised they could harness the power of the newsreels and commissioned their own public information films.
Look over the clothes you've got. See if they won't last a bit longer, or if they can be altered to present-day needs.
Whether people liked it or not, Pathé would tell them how to live their lives.
Save your coupons for an emergency.
Until 1929, Pathé's newsreels, like the feature films of the day, were silent. To tell their stories, they used the written word presented on intertitles. When sound was added to the newsreels, it was a wake-up call to the nation. At first, it wasn't much more than a title board with some music and location sound. But as the 1930s progressed, Pathé began experimenting with voiceover, and by the middle of the decade, the newsreel commentator had become a force to be reckoned with. Now Pathé could develop a voice all of its own.
Factories humming puts railway traffic on the mend, and this latest streamlined engine is one more signal that the railways are in a better position than they have been for years past.
The newsreel commentator spoke with this extraordinary confidence. They just launched into whatever the subject was. They would set the scene in a short, sharp sentence.
It was a sad sea drama when the proud Finnish windjammer struck the Devon rocks. The world hoped that she might be saved, but it was not to be.
And in an age before television, there was nothing more influential than what millions saw in the cinema every week.
In many ways, I think the newsreels reigned supreme. The newsreels were the best way for people to experience their world.
But often Pathé adopted an uncritical perspective on what they filmed.
Up to a point, newsreels, I think, reflected life, but also they manipulated it.
As shown in the 1936 documentary, The Great Crusade, Pathé didn't back away from difficult issues, like the housing crisis of the time.
In London alone, it's estimated that some 230,000 people live under conditions which are unfit for human habitation. Probably not 5 in every 100 of these dilapidated roofs are watertight. In one of these streets lives Molly, her mother, 2 brothers and baby sister. 5 of them in 2 rooms. The whole place is rotten from top to bottom. The decaying woodwork is infested with vermin. At night, the 5 of them, including a 6-month-old baby, sleep in one tiny bedroom. The children of today are the parents of the next generation. Unless these breeding places of dirt and disease are swept away, what sort of generation will it be? Are we going to perpetuate a C3 race?
Though they didn't shy away from the grim realities, the filmmakers also showed there were grounds for optimism.
It's got a wonderful little narrative that takes us from showing just how wretched slum conditions can be, sort of rats and mice running around over a child on the floor, through to a transformation.
Good afternoon, Mrs. Hardy.
Good
We've just come to see if everything's all
Oh,
right.
everything's okay. It's much better than the old place. Just like living in a new world.
It's a bit of a fairy tale. It's very strong on uplift. But at the same time, it's a film which would have reached an enormous number of people. Pathé was carrying a message about regeneration after the Depression to the mass audience.
2 years ago, the government started a 5-year plan to abolish the slums. This work is in its stride now. When the housebreakers take charge, you can really see how rotten these places are.
This optimistic tone was evident in much of Pathé's output during the Depression. In 1936, the company filmed a family forced by poverty to leave their home and live on a beach.
You'll remember the man they called Robinson, because he loved to Crusoe. Well, he's nothing to the Robinson Crusoe and Company we found on the seashore near Folkestone.
George and Sarah Chandler and their children went to live at the Warren when George went bankrupt in 1928. Their youngest daughters, Frida and Marjorie, born just a few years later, still remember growing up in tents.
We were down here on the beach 11 years altogether. I'm the one in the middle, swinging my legs, with an empty plate on my lap.
I'm the youngest, the little one in Mother's Arms in the Pathé film.
This is one of Crusoe's happy crew. Living in bell tents, these Spartan folk are expert cliff climbers and barricade their canvas homes against little bounders, like these chalk ones.
The film painted a very jolly picture of life on the beach, but chose to ignore the reality of hardship that lay behind their parents' tale.
They had a lovely house in Dover, and they had to sell that. And then they were living in lodgings, and they couldn't pay the rent. Mother brought the children home from school one day, and the lady said, "You can't come in, you haven't paid the rent." And so Dad decided to take them camping.
I think originally it was just camping, wasn't it? Like, we'll go down Folkestone Warren, which is right along the far end, where you can see the cliffs in the background, and we'll camp until I can find something better. But I think they just fell into the habit that there wasn't anything better than camping down the Warren.
But Marjorie was born, actually, on the beach.
On the foreshore, my birth certificate says. In a tent on the foreshore.
A boat to them is much more important than a bus to us landlubbers.
Looking at that film, it's all terribly upbeat and it's all great fun.
So life goes on, a shore life, but a gay one.
And that is kind of a metaphor for the way Pathé treated things. You know, everything was, you know, rather fun, and the British were sort of quite game and quite feisty, and they got on with life.
But for those fortunate enough to remain in work and keep their homes, things were looking brighter.
New industries were producing for the domestic market. There was something of a consumer boom.
And Pathé set to work showing you what was now available.
Good morning.
People could touch, they could buy things, you know, could buy a lot more things than they'd ever been able to buy before because of mass production.
One of the most popular consumer products was the motor car. Responding to the steep increase in traffic, Pathé produced one of Britain's earliest road safety films, starring entertainer Bobby Hawes.
The curb drill has just been introduced, and we know that as you go to the curb, you look right, you look left, you look right again, and then you cross over the road. But that was completely new in 1930. So I think what Pathé did was to make it instructional in an entertaining way, and that's what the newsreels and the cine magazines do best. So you basically have this well-known personality from the music hall with a whole line of chorus girls, and that would be something which would stick in people's minds.
Nice girls, come on, loosen up. Nellie.
Pathé's filmmakers were keen to promote health, as well as road safety.
The government was very concerned about the health of the nation, particularly actually after the 1936 Berlin Olympics, where most of the medals had been won by Germany and a few by America. So they pumped money into Keep Fit.
This fitness initiative may have been prompted by government concerns about the militarisation of Germany. During World War I, officials were alarmed to discover that many Britons were unfit for active service. With another war looming, Whitehall wanted Britain to shape up.
Used to be called Keep Fit for the military. They took out for the military and it just became Keep Fit. And that meant playing fields, it meant swimming pools, these wonderful open-air lidos that were built. There were Keep Fit movements, Molly, Bagot Stacks, Health and Beauty League. Almost like Busby Berkeley's synchronised exercise, thousands of legs all waving in the air.
Around the same time, Pathé newsreels showed the mass fitness regimes that had been introduced in Germany. The country was the object of increasing fascination among British cinema-goers in the 1930s. Evidence of the Nazis' determination to build a formidable military machine was a source of much anxiety among a population that vividly remembered the horrors of the Great War.
This year they say there are 800,000 pairs of boots standing heel to heel, waiting for the Führer's final speech.
And yet, at first, Pathé presented a largely uncritical view of Hitler's Germany.
They really wanted to be nice to everybody. And of course, to us, it seems ludicrous that they went to such lengths to be nice to Herr Hitler and Signor Mussolini. But they did, because they were international companies, and they had no wish to be ahead of governments. And of course, these were periods when all the governments were being nice to each other, right up until the months before the outbreak of the Second World War.
Pathé's editorial line was consistent with the British policy of appeasement, despite ominous signs of mounting international tensions. And with preparations being made for the possibility of war, Pathé reflected the nation's deep unease about entering another global conflict.
As workers evacuate the goods and records of business into the country, nowhere is there any wild patriotic excitement, but everywhere there is a deep hatred of war. There's complete confidence in British power, if it should be brought to the test, but there is no confidence in the power of violence and slaughter to make the world a better place to live in. And in Britain's ports, as the boats bring in still more of our vital food supplies, the merchant seamen know from their travels that in the hearts of the German people there is the same preference for the joys of peace against the horrors of war.
But just 3 days after that newsreel was first screened, Germany invaded Poland and Britain declared war. Almost immediately, Pathé's tone was transformed.
Everything we do is inspired by the absolute conviction that a great evil must be removed from the world. That evil is the spirit of faithlessness, of intolerance, of bullying, and of senseless criminal ambition embodied in Hitler and all those who surround him.
From then on, the newsreel companies were expected to rally the nation against the common enemy. The day after war broke out, the government set up the Ministry of Information to impose censorship and commission propaganda. Now there was an official body to decide what the British people should see and to prepare the nation for the trials ahead.
The interesting thing is that the state is using film in wartime. We've always had public safety information going out, but that would have been within pamphlets, within advertisements, within radio. And what you see in the Second World War is the explosion in the use of film, because it's an incredibly persuasive medium, and it's a form of communication where the government can literally reach the whole population.
If you're in the open with no cover, lie down, preferably in a ditch. If you're within 5 minutes of your home, go home, but keep away from the windows. But the most important rule of all is never to stand staring at the sky. If you don't take cover, you may get hurt.
As Britain faced the realities of the Blitz in 1940, Pathé employed the man whose voice would become synonymous with their company for the next 30 years.
We of Pathé salute the soldier.
Bob Danvers-Walker, who was born in Surrey in 1906 and lived an adventurous life. In the 1920s, he served in the Australian Yeomanry before pursuing a career on the airwaves in Britain and France. When war broke out, he was broadcasting from Normandy for the Forces Radio. But his counterblasts against Nazi propaganda brought him to enemy attention.
He was on the blacklist for Goebbels, and they wanted to annihilate him because he was propaganda and all that, you see, and he had to get out.
Bob Danvers-Walker brought his young family back to England just before the retreat from Dunkirk. Pathé almost immediately snapped him up to be their commentator and briefly the editor.
Ladies and gentlemen, as the regular Pathé Gazette commentator,
Bob would become the voice of Pathé, and during the war, in his distinctive style, he would exhort the British population to resist the menace of the Nazis.
breathes there the man with soul so dead, who never to himself has said, "This is my own, my native land." At this time such words may well serve to stimulate our determination to resist, with all the strength we can command, the vileness of an avaricious foe who seeks to plunder all that we hold dear.
The style was very formal in a way. I think that was the expected thing, wasn't it? You know, that the so-called upper middle classes were always considered to be the leaders, and I think that he was one of the representatives, perhaps.
This was also a time when all the radio announcers spoke with very upper-class accents. So the newsreels had to play along with that, even though they were often, their work was being seen in places where the accents and the attitudes would have been very, very different.
To British manhood and British womanhood is left the proud task of saving civilization from the rank and defiling growth of barbarism.
His voice was very stentorian, gung-ho, and jingoistic, you know, that sort of thing. And I think he was of his type and period. That was the sort of way they delivered things in those days. And it was the war effort, really, wasn't it? Everybody had to be patriotic and sound positive and enthusiastic, and we're going to beat the Huns and all the rest of it, you know.
We stand foursquare to fight as we have never fought before, and we are left, or shall be left alone, the last that dare to struggle with the foe.
I think the radio and the newsreels were incredibly important during the war. He symbolised, I suppose, continuity and authority and reassurance. It's a bit like a pilot on an aeroplane going through turbulence. You know, these sort of rather reassuring voices talking over some really rather dreadful scenes. It must have been very reassuring, I think, to people.
Hastening to be with his people of Coventry in their hour of adversity, the King was an inspiration to the stricken but courageous inhabitants. They came through the ordeal magnificently. This is their greatest hour.
It's a very particular tone of voice. It's brisk, it moves pretty quickly, the kind of person you can imagine, you know, holding forth at a bar.
Welcome home, Terry.
Thanks, Bob. And it's nice to be back. You bet.
Take a chair, because I'm going to grill you.
All right, Bob, go ahead.
Pathé used Bob's voice to make an emotional connection with the British people at this time of national emergency. The newsreel was the ideal medium to get a morale-boosting message across to the largest possible audience.
Every man and woman, uniformed or working clothed, is in the front line. Crusaders of the home front, the Navy, the Army, and the Air Force fight in the battle for civilization.
I think Pathé during the war was both the mirror of Britain at war, but it also, of course, shaped Britain at war.
Mrs. Barker's home has been bombed by the Huns, but it'll take more than that to move her.
Yes, even as Hitler and Göring, murderers as they are, come night after night and bomb us, I'm determined to stop in my house. I've been here 27 years and still am determined to defy them and stop here.
That's the spirit of the people.
Even when reporting the worst impact of the Blitz, filmmakers would strive to convey, sometimes in humorous terms, the courage and fortitude of the people.
As hoses still play on the smouldering ruins, a fireman is heard to say, Blimey, he wasn't half cross with us last night. Let every honour be given to the rescue parties, nurses and doctors, who toil for hours among the wreckage, bringing help and easing the suffering of survivors.
A lot of Pathé's content was obviously to do with the Blitz spirit. It told a sort of a myth, really. I mean, it gave the impression that absolutely everybody climbed out of the wreckage of their home singing "They'll Always Be in England." It did not show any of the real horrors of war.
Meanwhile, London carries on with unshakable mien. Windows may be broken, but the spirit remains intact. Dear Sir, please note our new address.
Despite the bravado of its pronouncements, Pathé was encouraging parents to send their children as far away as possible from Britain's vulnerable cities.
So it's goodbye to the cities and danger areas, labelled and loaded and not forgetting their gas masks. The children head for the special trains, and they're not worrying, they're off on a holiday.
Giving the impression that evacuation was an awfully great adventure was just one of the ways Pathé did its patriotic duty, supporting government policy and boosting morale. The newsreel companies would also play a large part in communicating the official message coming directly from the Ministry of Information. Tagged onto the end of the newsreels, the so-called fillers were one of the most important weapons in the government's propaganda arsenal.
To work, girls. Get cracking. Remember...
During the war, the ministry commissioned Pathé and other companies to make and distribute over 2,000 of these films.
The government have organised a nationwide collection of household scrap to be turned into chicken feed. It's ration-free and it solves the poultry keepers' problems.
Well, the Second World War becomes the golden age of the public information film. And it's, I would say, a very good medium if you want to try and change people's behaviour. And you have a whole plethora of different public information films advising people on what to grow, what to eat, how to use their gas masks. It's every aspect of people's lives they're being advised on here. People will go to the newsreel theatre and they will sit through a whole hour-long programme of news, and then they'll go to the cinema and sit through the newsreel programme all over again. So they might have been looking at these public information films maybe 3 or 4 times. So in that sense, that message is going to come through.
I am the fuel demon, and I have come to warn you that this waste must stop.
It was a way of encouraging people, but also informing them about what they had to do. They had to carry their identity cards, they had to wear an identity badge, they had to carry their ration book. Also, it needed to inform them about new regulations. I mean, Britain was an extremely regulated country in the Second World War.
The contents of a man's pocket nowadays show many of the little things we have got used to. Whistle, ration card, petrol coupons, identity cards, a torch, not forgetting lunch in case his favourite restaurant isn't there anymore.
During the war, the Ministry of Information launched several inventive campaigns with titles such as Make, Do and Mend, Dig for Victory and Salvage to encourage people to make the most of the scarce resources available.
People were bombarded with information during the war, on radio, in the newspaper, in leaflets coming through the door, and of course on newsreels.
One day George went to the cinema to cheer himself up. When he went in, they were showing one of those official films. And what do you think it was about? Well, see for yourself.
Bones are of vital use in the war effort.
The idea about salvage was that you had to save absolutely everything. It was forever making cartoons about salvage, so you had to throw nothing away. And Pathé was absolutely there in the foreground of encouraging that.
Ladies and gentlemen, there is a moral to this story. Have you a skeleton in your cupboard? Give it to salvage and have a clear conscience.
It was a way of getting people involved in the war effort, to make them feel that they had a role in the war, that the country was united, there was an external common enemy, and Britain was fighting back.
We haven't got enough coupons. And I've got to have a few for towels and things for the house. Perhaps we can help you. And who may you be? Your old clothes, put away and forgotten. Use us now. For instance, I could make a smart costume for the young lady.
That's all very well, but I've never turned a pair of trousers into a skirt in my life.
Never mind. It's quite easy to do. Ask at your technical institute.
Or why not get together with your friends and form a make, do and mend group?
Even more important in military terms was the campaign Careless Talk Costs Lives, aimed at preventing sensitive information being leaked to enemy agents.
Lovesick John Jones met indiscreet Mary Brown.
If you knew something perhaps about where your soldier husband was being sent, or, you know, if there was a war factory near you or something like that, somebody might overhear, and then that might put people's lives at risk.
He said to her, "Let's go to Coomwood for a picnic on Saturday, Mary." She said to him,
We can't do that, silly. It's closed to the public. There's a dump of our new mine detectors there.
the consequence was, and the world said,
"That's your fault, Mary." Very often they were very simplistic, and everybody knew that. I mean, they were just preposterously naive.
The Browns at home. Suddenly, the alarm. Enemy aircraft are here, but the Browns are prepared to tackle the worst. An incendiary bomb hits the house. It burns very violently for the first minute, but after that it can be tackled.
I did have to laugh about putting out the incendiary bomb. I mean, you have a fire in your house, it's burning the carpet, throw on some water. End of film. But no, you have to see people fetching a bucket, fetching a hose, alerting a neighbour, getting some help. And meanwhile, the carpet's curling up at the corners as a little bit of fire gets going.
Miss Smith arrives. She has received training from the local authorities, which you too can receive. Brown decides to operate the pump away from the heat and smoke.
Among the most important and effective of all the official films shown by Pathé was a series of recruitment trailers urging women to show some pluck and sign up.
If you are between the ages of 17 and a half and 45, there is a job waiting for you, a job that must be filled.
I saw a recruitment programme given by Pathé News that they needed women to volunteer because the soldiers were over fighting and they needed girls to take up their jobs. And I thought, oh, I'll have a bit of that. I got a bit fed up with going in the shelters every night, so I joined up.
Penny served in the Auxiliary Territorial Service, known as the ATS.
Why, Pat, I haven't seen you for ages. How do you like the ATS? Fine. How's everyone at the office? Oh, all right. I say, you do look smart. I must say I envy you your job. Well, you don't have to. Why don't you join us? It's a grand life.
It was an eye-opener. I didn't realise that women could be so useful until I saw the Pathé News. The uniform looked good, although it was itchy and that, but it looked good, and apart from being useful, I thought it was exciting, and I thought, you know, I'd meet different people. I liked the camaraderie. I liked the social life as well, because believe it or not, I mean, they had lots of dances.
Pathé was keen to emphasise the more glamorous aspects of women's wartime roles. They even gave helpful fashion advice for working women.
The Vingle hairstyle, the shortcut for victory. If your war job is where the wheels are turning, it's only common sense to play for safety and keep your hair short. Believe you me, a hair on the head's worth two in the machinery. The partings form 4 V's, hence V-Ingle, Vingle.
But as war drew to a close and husbands returned home, women's roles were about to change. In this film entitled A Tribute to Women, Pathé dramatised an encounter between a returning serviceman and his dutiful wife.
This is the story of a soldier's wife, just one woman among the many thousands who waited. For her, it's the greatest day of all. Her man is coming home.
There was the fear. What had happened after the First World War, of course? Men had come back from the war and they'd found that women had taken their jobs. The word was dilution, and sometimes, therefore, pay had fallen as a result of that. And there was a great anxiety that this might happen after the Second World War. And one of the inducements of the Second World War was that men were promised their jobs back when they came out of the forces.
Pathé quickly shifted its attitude to working women, preparing them for their rather less exciting post-war lives. The same women they'd urged to join up were now being encouraged to step away from their jobs and back into their pre-war roles.
Many thousands of wartime brides have never had a chance of cooking for their service husbands. Fairly grim outlook for the old man when he comes home, did you say? Not at all, if he had the sense to marry an ATS girl.
The attitude to women is amazing. It's like being back in the Victorian era.
How's that pie getting on? Looks pretty good. There's one husband at least who, when he gets home, won't need to whistle, "Ma, I miss your apple pie."
It's assumed that once the war is over, women will be back doing what women should do, which is to look after their husband and children. That is an absolutely universal assumption. And there's even a newsreel in which ATS girls are being taught how to lay a table and get the meal ready for the old man.
During their 10 days course as housewives, they are taught everything about running a home, even down to laying the table properly, so that when George's mother comes to stay, she won't be able to find fault.
Pathé News filmed that and made it look very patronising, but of course it was happening, so they can hardly be held indictable for that.
Women's roles would continue to change in the post-war years, but for now, everyone could celebrate a vital victory and a return to peace.
This was the British people's finest day. The day, the end of the German war. 6 long years. And all-embracing jubilation rings out in the victory peal from St. Paul.
Pathé had performed an essential role during the war. They'd acted as mouthpiece for the government to cajole, instruct and exhort the British public through the huge challenges faced on the home front. And they'd established a house style that epitomised Britain's plucky wartime spirit.
We know that in the days when the war seems remote and far away, these will be historic pictures. They will tell another generation how we celebrated Victory in Europe Day and how we thank the service chiefs who worked so valiantly to make it possible.
Britain was grateful to Churchill for leading the nation to victory, but his popularity as a war leader didn't translate into support for his party. In the 1945 general election, the nation voted Churchill and the Conservatives out and Labour's Clement Attlee in.
When it came to the post-war period, people were afraid if they voted Conservative, they would go back to the old Conservatives of the 1930s.
The sweeping victories throughout the country mark an epoch in the political life of this country.
One of the effects, I think, of the war, and particularly of the Blitz, was the feeling that there must never be going back to the inequalities of the 30s.
Pathé and the other newsreel companies supported the Labour Party's plans to build a new kind of future. Social change was high on the agenda. The new government promised to provide better prospects for the people who had given so much to help win the war.
The big change after the war, apart from the welfare state, was the huge house building program. We had to replace the homes that had been destroyed in the bombing and also replace the slums. And so that gave people a completely new opportunity for a good life.
Pathé's editors were keen to show the process of reconstruction and renewal.
Very much alive amid the dead ruins are the bright ideas of the post-war planners, the people who want to build up the old bricks into homes that are new. The war has rather upset the old idea of things being as safe as houses, so the planners aim at making the houses of the future not only safe, but serviceable.
In the 1930s, there had been terrible suffering, homelessness, slum conditions, misery, ill health, and people said, we're never, ever going to go back to that again.
But there was no easy solution to Britain's post-war housing crisis. So exasperated were some people by the shortage of homes that they took matters into their own hands.
There was an absolute crisis. People stormed barracks and occupied blocks of flats and all this sort of thing.
Peacetime battle report. The siege of London's Ivanhoe Hotel. On the pavement, police, pressmen and squatter sympathisers. Facing government action to evict them, the squatters carry on as best they can. Food supplies come up from below. Wholesale squatting in luxury flats and hotels turns the spotlight on a still desperate housing situation.
One official response to the crisis was the introduction of prefab housing. Pathé's films extolled the virtues of the government's quick-fix solutions.
The whole house can be erected rapidly by manual labour. The temporary prototype houses are the first of 30,000 to be put up in this country. They fit them together as easily as children's building blocks. This house of the future has no stairs, no dust-collecting wainscoting, and is intended to last about 10 years.
Though the prefabs were only meant to be temporary, Eddie O'Mahony has enjoyed living in his for the last 65 years.
My wife had applied to the London County Council for accommodation, and they said it was a prefab. I said, I don't want a prefab, I want a house. I'm fed up with living in tents and nissen huts and all that sort of thing. They said, before you turn it down, just go and have a look.
Eddie and his wife Ellen were one of many families who doubted the quality of prefab housing, but Pathé's films helped to overcome initial scepticism among the public. In their film Homes While You Wait, a middle-class couple are invited to test out prefab living.
George Smith, who will shortly be demobbed, and Mrs. Smith are looking for a house. That's not very unusual, but these are unusual days, and the usual sort of house is unusually scarce. So what do? They stop, they look, and they glisten. They glisten because they're on the track of a uniseco house. That is, a house that's made up of sections of portable units.
We made our way into number 6, and directly my wife opened the door. The first thing she said was, what a lovely big hall. We can get the pram in here. And we found not only an inside toilet, but a bathroom with a heated towel rack, immersion heater. Just put a switch on, we had instant hot water. I came into the dining room, and my wife said, oh, look how big it is. Start measuring up for the lino.
A hinged breakfast table is a space-saving idea. The refrigerator tops the list of the £80 worth of internal fittings built into Churchill Villa. Bedroom number 2 also has plenty of cupboards and, like the other rooms, is central heated.
I think it is very good indeed for a small house for the men who are coming home and the women who have been working hard in the factories and want to get back to family life. I think it is an ideal house.
Britain would gradually tackle its housing crisis, but as Pathé's films show, millions were still living on the breadline.
I did hope we might have it a bit easier now that there's no more war, but instead of that it's worse.
The post-war years were very difficult. We rationed bread for the first time after the war. We didn't ration it during the war, but when the Germans were starving, we rationed bread.
And this is the ration card itself. Take a good look. You're going to see it each day and every day for at least a year.
But we were sustained by the knowledge that we were engaged in a big project.
Pathé prepared the nation for the new National Health Service, which promised universal free healthcare from cradle to grave.
This leaflet is coming through your letterbox one day soon, or maybe you have already had your copy. Read it carefully.
To me, it was really moving, because I remember how wonderful the arrival of the National Health Service was. It was a miracle. It was overwhelmingly wonderful. And we were completely disbelieving that we could have all this free and that it was the same for everybody. what an incredible thing to have happened, and for Britain to have thought it up and to be putting it into practice. So that little modest snatch of newsreel is very poignant for those of us who were there at the time.
Well, it can or it can't.
The information films use some of the leading entertainers of the day, including comedian Tommy Trinder, to guide people through the various elements of the new welfare state.
So please everyone try, by the 5th of July, to have read the booklet right through. Put it safely away. You may need it one day. Then you can read what to do. Right? You lucky people.
These changes revolutionised the relationship between the people of Britain and the state. Pathé continued to show the government's official fillers to make sure everyone knew what they were now entitled to.
And there's shoes for Betty and a suit for George.
I'm not made of money. It's impossible to go on like this. But wait a minute. I've just read a piece about family allowances. We can get 10 shillings a week for our 3.
Oh, you'll never get that.
Oh, yes, you will. The first family allowances will be paid on August the 6th of this year.
What the public information films are trying to do is almost drag the British people bodily into a cleaner, better world.
Your national insurance number is extremely important to you. Make a note of it so that it's always at hand.
Some of the most inventive of these public information fillers were made by this man, the independent filmmaker Richard Massingham, whose films were distributed by Pathé and other newsreel companies. Massingham had worked in medicine but turned to filmmaking later in life. In a series of imaginative and entertaining films, he cast himself as a dim-witted, accident-prone everyman in need of sound advice to cope with the changing world.
The proper place for your number being, of course, on every claim you make under the new national insurance scheme.
He's right, you know. I'm going abroad. Hooray!
Massingham brought a comedic touch to his fillers, which were used to instruct the population on virtually every aspect of their lives.
Hey, you can't take all those notes with you. You can take your holiday or business allowance in traveller's cheques, but not more than £5 in sterling notes. Do you know that? You understand English? Good. Well, remember, you can take out £5 in notes.
Massingham's films were not notable for their subtlety, but they used humour to dispense practical information and advice.
£5 in notes. Get it?
Other films from the period were more serious and censorious in tone.
When George gets on, we often find that other folk get left behind.
This information film tried to discourage unnecessary journeys on public transport at a time when even buses were in short supply.
Perhaps I'm just a transport hog.
One of the government's obsessions, evident in the public information films of the 1940s, anticipates a major preoccupation of our own time, health and safety.
Poor woman. One of the 700 people who die in Britain every year through falling downstairs because high heels catch in frayed carpets, bad lighting, some hidden obstacle, too highly polished lino.
Well, first of all, you had to demonstrate that there was a danger and you had to frighten people, but then you had to empower them and say this is how you can avoid that danger.
Fix those loose stair rods, tack down that frayed carpet, mend that hole in the lino. Don't wait, or you may be the next. Watch your steps.
From how not to pack your parcels to how to buy your stamps, the government's post-war fillers sometimes tipped into nannying the nation and showed the extent of increasing state intervention in people's lives.
If you're telling parents when they should be putting their children to bed, then that's quite controversial.
Wee Willie Winkie runs through the town, upstairs and downstairs in his nightgown. Tapping at the window, crying through the lock, are the children in their beds? It's 7 o'clock. Wee Willie Winkie in this rhyme hadn't heard of our summertime, but really thoughtful parents know children must sleep a lot to grow.
It wasn't just the information films that became increasingly opinionated. After the war, some of Pathé's newsreel reports also adopted a moralising tone, especially after the arrival of Clement Cave in 1946, who swiftly rose from news editor to editor.
With Clement Cave, you can really see the voice and the tone of Pathé changing. It becomes a lot more socially aware. You could even say it's becoming very left-leaning at that point as well. And that is very unusual for a newsreel.
For 50 years, Britain's miners have demanded the nationalisation of the mining industry. Their campaign began in the pioneering days of Keir Hardie and Bob Smiley. It has ended in 1947. From now on, the people take over.
Cave completely changed the style, the format. He very much believed that television news was on the way, that there was great competition for the newsreels, and that they had to adapt with the times.
Even Pathé's traditional entertainment strands reflected their increasing social awareness at this time, like the 1947 film entitled Pathé Pictorial Looks East-West, which contrasted the poorest boroughs of the capital with the most affluent.
It's a fascinating film because it trades on stereotypes, and it really suggests that the East End is where there's real community, and the West End is where there's no community, where they're just a bunch of rich people living very isolated lives.
The East End kid may dream of the Oval or Old Trafford, but his playground is all too often the place where the bomb dropped. He learns to take his pleasure where he can. What have they got that the other fellow hasn't? Probably a nanny keeping an eye on them. A nanny who never lets them out of her sight. These children of the West who must dress up even to play in the park. It's great fun pretending you're a real sea captain, but isn't it rather lonely this way, on your own, with no one to share it?
Is this social criticism? No, I think it's trading on stereotypes, but it is at least putting them in front of people, and it's providing kind of fascinating insight into the social divisions in Britain in the post-war period.
In 1947, Cave commissioned a film that went one step further to try and raise awareness of the lack of social care for the elderly. In explicitly political terms, Cave told his audience that they had a duty to support his campaign for change.
This is the story of Britain's old people. People too old to speak for themselves, with no one to speak for them. If this were a scene from Charles Dickens, we would shudder at it. Yet this is in Britain, in 1947.
It's fine to talk about a certain social issue from a political standpoint, slightly left of centre, slightly right of centre. You might get away with that. But the line that he crossed with that is that at the end of that story, he exhorts the audience to go and lobby their MPs.
The problem is, what can you do about it? You have an MP, write to him. You elect councillors, press them. You have newspapers, write to them. Once the public conscience is aroused, the fear of old age will be banished forever. The demand should be, this system must go.
It raises a very interesting question about what the role of news on screen should be. What comes back from the audience and also from the exhibitors is that that is not what its role is. There's a very British tradition of the news being impartial.
As a result of films such as this, Clement Cave was demoted from the top job at Pathé and soon left the company for good. After that brief foray into radical campaigning, with films critical of the status quo, Pathé returned to its more traditional approach, producing positive films that endorsed government policy.
Line upon line, main lines, branch lines, loop lines, junction upon junction, network upon network. Mighty achievement that was an inspiration for the world.
Transport was a longer film that Pathé's documentary unit made to promote the government's nationalisation of Britain's transport network.
What we see here is very much a traditional British documentary style. A documentary with very high production values beautifully shot, has great commentary, and is there as a public relations vehicle.
In less than a century, 120 separate undertakings had reduced themselves to 4, and now reduced to 1. Road transport, railways, canals and docks. To view them all together and make them work as one.
This film was one of several that showed how the country's industry and economy were getting back on track. Pathé's cameras were on hand 4 years later, when Britain was keen to showcase its industrial progress.
London's South Bank exhibition is ready to show the world what Britain can do.
In 1951, the Festival of Britain seemed to herald the beginning of the end of austerity. For many, it brightened the national mood by presenting an optimistic vision for the future.
Britain in the late 40s was a pretty grey, threadbare place. And in that kind of environment, the Festival of Britain is actually something exciting and different to do. And that's why you get so many tens of millions of people who either go to the South Bank to see it or they're lapping it up on the newsreels, because it represents the first kind of bit of good news, the first sort of flash of enthusiasm and colour that a lot of people have had for a long time.
The royal party will begin their inspection at the great Dome of Discovery. Escalators carry visitors to the top floor, an indication of the vastness of this ultra-modern building. In the dome, exhibits tell the glorious story of Britain's lead in discovery and exploration, both on this planet and in the universe beyond.
Britain was poised to enter this new era of consumerism and of the space age and the jet age and whatnot.
The South Bank exhibition, Britain's proof to a doubting world that she still leads in science and discovery, draws to its close.
I think people saw it as a rare opportunity, really, to feel proud about being British, to feel kind of buoyant, to feel they got their reward. And Singing Jerusalem, it's a classic example of that kind of collective spirit.
Despite our troubles, this year of festival has been a great British accomplishment.
In the same year, Churchill's Conservatives were voted back into power.
By the voice of the people, Winston Churchill is once again called to guide our destiny.
The new Conservative government would commission far fewer public information films. As a result, Pathé's output became less concerned with social provision and public advice. Instead, the company addressed the aspirations of a new generation of consumers.
It must be spring again, because here's the Daily Mail Ideal Homes exhibition open, and for any young man whose fancy lightly turns to thoughts of love, as usual, it's full of good ideas. For instance, the Women's Institute House. 400,000 women gave their suggestions for what would make a home ideal, and here's the result. The kitchen is brimful of little niceties only a housewife would notice.
Suddenly we get a vision of the new housing, the new gadgets, the new lifestyles. And that comes through very strongly, I think, in the Pathé newsreels of the 1950s.
But why talk of love and money in the same breath? So long as you're only dreaming, why not do the girl proud?
Do the girl proud, it says at the Ideal Home exhibition, because you were meant to aspire to a beautiful home and that was your job.
When people are asked, what do you care about? What will make you vote one particular way in a general election, their answers are almost always the same. The number one thing is prices, the price of things. Basically what they want to do is they want to make sure they can continue buying more and more things and kind of sharing in the good life. That's what they want.
Half the fun of these exhibitions are the gadgets, and as usual, there are plenty. Here's something that'll do a lot of useful jobs. With different fittings, you can mix food and then clean up the mess. But some things here aren't what they seem by a long shot. That isn't champagne, it's a sham bottle.
Pathé's films delighted in the excitement of consumerism. Their new unofficial message was spend, spend, spend.
Patiently waiting, their hearts palpitating, they stand there in line, biding the time till they open the doors at the multiple stores.
The Battle of the Sales was wonderful because it was done in rhyming couplets. And that's for several reasons. One, it's fun. Two, it's the activity of women, and you don't need to be very serious about that. You can mock it gently while reporting on it, and nobody will notice very much.
Perhaps it's a dress costing £2 or less you come here to fight for, having waited all night for.
You notice very much from today's perspective, because it seems condescending, but it's quite fun. It's of its time.
For a coat or a cape, whatever your shape, they'll find one to fit. No, that isn't it. From napkins to shrouds, the battling crowds choose their new linen. I wonder who's winning. That's a nice sheet, but oh, my poor feet. In with the oil, the machine's on the boil. The best of us fail at a January sale.
In 1957, Harold Macmillan made this speech that I think to a lot of people sums up the spirit of the 1950s. He went to Bedford and he said, let's face it, you know, most of our people have never had it so good.
There's nothing historical about this kitchen. It contains some of the most up-to-date gadgets on the market.
It was interesting he said you never had it so good. It should have been you never had it so goods.
One of the goods more and more people could afford was a television in their homes. The popularity of TV entertainment meant a steep decline in cinema attendance. Pathé and the newsreels no longer enjoyed the influence they once had. But the company had never entirely given up on the production of public information films in which they could admonish errant drivers in traditional Pathé style.
Look at that. Road manners, where are they? Have you ever shown bad manners like this? Have you ever stopped your car in the middle of the road and to blazes with everyone? You can see people do, and it's downright daft and selfish.
But Pathé's paternalistic messages no longer carried the authority they had in their heyday.
By the 1960s, the newsreel has really passed its peak. It's past its sell-by date, and some of the Pathé material of the 1960s is really quite touching because it feels like an older brother or a father trying to kind of get with the young people.
Brace yourself for it and prepare to meet, in some sort of action, a hippie. This is history, all right. This is what they call a love-in.
The kind of stiff, mannered, affected voice of the newsreel, which had seemed so authoritative, is becoming old-fashioned. In fact, an authoritative voice at all is kind of, you know, passé.
Now the once commanding newsreel could only watch from the sidelines as the nation was swept up by rapid and radical change.
This, ladies and gentlemen, is London. Swinging London, it's been called, though some people might find a different adjective. Social rebels have taken over in what seems more like an invasion than a revolution, because they've got their own new language that is way out and weird, to say the least.
The newsreels are suddenly amazingly dated. I mean, they were as old-fashioned clothes. They were just absolutely out of it.
Perhaps some of us are just getting old and crusty and forgetting what it meant to be young and active in every sort of way.
At its peak, Pathé had spoken to the nation with unshakable authority. It guided the British people through times of peril and celebrated moments of joy. It recorded our hardship and privation and documented our national renewal. Their films showed the country's problems, offered solutions, and provided life-enhancing and, in some cases, life-saving information. Pathé's paternalistic tone may seem overly moralistic by today's standards.
Ladies and gentlemen, as the regular Pathé...
But for a generation, Bob Danvers-Walker articulated the concerns, aspirations and values of Britain. The voice of Pathé was also the voice of a nation.